Have you ever woken up without an enemy? If you have, then you are fully equipped to appreciate the beauty of the drama of Eastern and Western Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you haven't, that's not necessarily a problem. You will still learn a lot from this video, probably a new emotion even. So, in the late December 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it collapsed the conflict. It wasn't just a military conflict, of course, it was a Cold War, and so much the better. It was an ideological conflict. And imagine now what happens when something that gave meaning to your entire life, that illuminated your entire sense of self, what now they fashionably call identity, has collapsed. That there are no longer notions, clear notions of good and evil. There's no sense of purpose. There is no meaning. And that conflict has persisted, that with all its meanings, persisted for no less than 2 generations. What is to be done? Not many people thought about this, but that situation of radical change is a situation pregnant with the risks. In tarot cards, that may or may not be familiar to you, that system has a particular card called Death. It's a card number 13 in the major arcana. For anyone who is not familiar with the system and the meaning of that card, it's a scary card, effectively. It's often drawn as a skeleton. In actual fact, that card has nothing to do with death. What it signifies is major transformation, radical transition from one situation to another. And folded within this, and there's an idea that this situation can be likened to death. Something died, something new is going to be born. That something is highly uncertain. And the situation is such that the societies or personalities go through some sort of a liminal period, where old rules no longer apply, but new rules are not in existence as yet. That is precisely what happened in Eastern and Western Europe at the time. Eastern Europe simply took that death card out of the deck. Now, I would share with you a memory. Many moons ago, I collaborated on a project with the Institute of Public Health in Cambridge, and project coordinators invited, as an enrichment really, seminar, several major personalities in the British civil service, National Health Service, and such like, to talk to us about the epidemiology of British community, really, British population. One very memorable figure that came to visit us as part of this seminar series was a senior officer in the British prison service. It was an Asian gentleman. He came uniformed, and there was something arresting about him. He gave us a short biographical note explaining how he came to be in the prison service, and became clear very quickly that for him it was a second life. His first life, 30 or more years, was spent in the British Army. And he described his transition to the prison service in the following way. He said, and I remember it vividly, "One day I woke up, and I woke up without an enemy." He related to that fateful late December, 26th, 27th of December 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. This was the report of the British officer. Luckily for him, he was close to retirement at that time, and also the path to the prison service was clear to him, that his skills were transferable. So for him, the transition from the old to the new was smoothed somehow by that. Hundreds, thousands of officers on both sides of the dividing line, Eastern and Western Europe, simply didn't have that. And in actual fact, there are documented cases of suicides of Soviet officers who they left several suicide notes, as people tend to do in these moments, for the family, for the friends, and for the society, and where they stated very clearly that life is no longer possible for them in a situation where the entire system of meaning to which they dedicated their lives collapsed in front of their eyes. They saw no sense at all in continuing living, as tragic as it sounds. I would add, on an aside, that the Russian army at the time probably was in the most dire condition. That is because, although the society was in a state of crisis, but at least the society could be resuscitated by the beginnings of the private market that took upon itself functions that the state played before. With the structures such as the army, that simply couldn't happen. Armies squarely depend on the capacities of the state. The state was collapsing, underperforming. The private sector could not help much. And so the soldiers and the officers could not even be trained. They didn't even have equipment. They didn't have bullets. Some of them were simply, some military units were hired by the newly emerging private sector as workers, as available labor force. It was a disaster all along. So that is the meaning of the that's what happened in Eastern Europe at that time. Now there was another insight that officer shared with us, and it stayed with me, and I think it's appropriate to share it with you as well. He talked to us quite a bit about epidemiology of the prison population, and one thing that he highlighted was the reality, misinterpreted, misunderstood, misconstrued reality of what is called home visits for the prisoners. There is a routine of home visits for different prisoners. Of course, the implementation of that depends on the nature of the crime, on the behavior of the convict, etc. But many of them have home visits, and these home visits are not understood adequately by the general population. They're perceived as a sort of attempt of the system to indulge the prisoner. In actual fact, the whole system of the visits has been developed with something completely different in mind, and that something is the reduction in reoffending. The prison system understands and anticipates that at some point the prisoner will serve his or her time, and at that point they will go back to the community they came from. Having been separated from it for several years, they're not expected to have any meaningful connections within that community, and so their return will only mean that reoffending is pretty much on the cards. By providing home visits, the prison service creates the situation, or at least attempts to create a situation, where the prisoner remains embedded in the community throughout their time. And so when they go back to something, some sort of system that will support them then. Thereby, we're hoping reducing the risk of reoffending. In other words, there is a prophylactic action that is rooted in understanding of those post-release realities, and there is explicit acknowledgement that aftercare is needed in this situation where the radical transition is made from the theoretically unwelcome situation of imprisonment to theoretically welcome situation of freedom. That freedom for that individual who has been shaped by the forces of imprisonment for so many years, that this situation is, the situation of freedom, is also pregnant with the risks. I have studied voluminous materials in the history of the Cold War and the Soviet collapse and the post-collapse reality, and I'm pretty sure that nobody have thought about the transition from one system to another in those terms. Identifying those risks, that aftercare was appropriate in that situation. Indeed, one of the very senior American diplomats, Dan Fried, said that the authors of the American security architecture in Europe, as he called it, never anticipated that the world of conflict will collapse. They operated as if the systems that they were building will operate in eternity. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not anticipated broadly but it's something that certain specialists, Sovietologists, and demographers, in actual fact, were talking about. Yet, it hasn't made a mark, let's say, certainly not on American diplomacy as far as I can see it. Why to talk about this in the introduction to the Defeat of the West, which is Emmanuel Todd's new book, which I will be reviewing here? It is clear to me that a reader that would want to appreciate a book needs that introduction. The preface of Emmanuel Todd starts with paraphrasing some ideas from a speech that the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, gave on the day of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the 24th of February 2022. And that's the right thing to do. It's a document, and I can see that Emmanuel Todd works carefully with the documents, as he should, being a historian. That, however, as a technique, choosing this date to start the story is too late. In my view, what needs to be understood before the book is appreciated is the history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and now completely forgotten history of its counterweight in Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact. Both structures were born in the late 40s and the beginning of the 50s. Both structures are symbolic of the Cold War. The logic behind their creation, their history, need to be understood. One of them collapsed 6 months before the collapse of the Soviet Union. That is the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a defensive alliance of Eastern European communist and socialist countries. It's almost natural to anticipate that would happen. Yes, so the Soviet power collapsed, and so all of its sponsored structures are expected to go as well, and they did. NATO, however, remained. It remained in a world that is theoretically now was free of conflict. What was the purpose of that organization? How did it see its own role in the new conflict-free Europe? This is something that I'm going to examine in this video. Intellectual journeys are not disciplined. They cannot be structured, and writing them up in a structured form is a work of art. Emmanuel Todd masters this art, and his book, The Defeat of the West, is the ultimate proof of that. In the preface to his book, he presents 10 observations that form a skeleton of the book, and then he takes each of them separately and develops and fleshes it out in a separate chapter. Here, in this video, I will deal with just 3 of them. Perhaps these are the most central for understanding of the entire book. The first one is the nature of the war between Russia and Ukraine, or, to be precise, what we conventionally and unthinkingly call Russia-Ukraine war. According to Todd, this is in reality a war between Russia and the United States of America. The war is taking place in the European theater of war, or Ukrainian theater of war. This is undoubted. However, that is just a theater. The actors and the actresses have been imported from elsewhere. His second statement is that American behavior in this war has been hesitant, inconsistent. And the value of this observation grows when we think about when actually it was made. By now, in summer 2026, when I'm recording this video, the whole pattern of American behavior is easily observable. But when Emmanuel Todd wrote the book, it was not. He must have written it under the impression of the events taking place in 2022, perhaps 2023. In 2024, the French edition of the book was already published. His observation, therefore, is prescient. The third observation, and the most interesting in my view, is that, according to Todd, European allies of the United States, be it the Western or Eastern European countries, and particularly Germany, do not behave in a way that their own interests dictate. In other words, they go against their interest. They unthinkingly or perhaps submissively, in a way that's damaging, accept American agenda. It is being imposed on them. The example that Todd uses to emphasize is the German lack of desire or lack of will to pursue vigorously the investigation of the major act of international terrorism, which is the destruction of the Nord Stream. Nord Stream, of course, is a system of pipelines jointly owned by Germany and Russia that take Russian gas to Europe. In this way, Russia, what they call, supplied Europe with Russian gas. This system of gas pipes was destroyed early in the war, and the first attempts at the investigation, of course, pointed the finger at Russia. It then became quite clear that the story is, at the very least, more complicated. And the latest journalistic investigation pointed in the direction of Ukraine and perhaps some forces associated with the Ukrainian cause at the very least. The truth of that behind it is not entirely clear. The official investigation has never been conducted, or at least it hasn't been published, or at least the results haven't been promoted. One thing is clear, that those countries that have been damaged by this development do not pursue it very vigorously. Now, I will reflect on those three observations in this video, and ultimately, towards the end, I will come back to them again, assess their veracity. In anticipation, I will tell you that I will accept two and perhaps question, if not reject, one. And you will have to wait till the end to know which one and why. In the meantime, I'll start in the order that I presented them and ask a very simple question. According to Emmanuel Todd, the war actually is between Russia and the United States of America. In order to understand that claim, really, we have to go on a historical tour and ask ourselves, before the war, how did the relationship between Russia and America looked? And for that, we have to go to the very beginning, to the very roots of that relationship. And to do that, we will have to go to the beginning of the world as we know it, the political and the geopolitical world that makes sense to us today, really, was created in the aftermath of the Second World War. If you're looking parenthetically for a succinct way to present history, political history, of course, of Europe in the 20th century, political history of Europe in the 20th century is the history of two organizations. The one called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO, and the other is the Warsaw Pact. So if you're looking for a sort of a shortcut, a short history of Europe, a political history of Europe, for example, to talk to your teenage child about that, that's your best bet. I hope I will convince you in what I'm going to say. In 1949, what we call NATO today was created. And it was created as in a way that can surprise those who acutely observed the events during the Second World War. In the Second World War, the United States of America and Soviet Union were allies. They were fighting together against the Nazi Germany. In 1949, when NATO was created, it was created on the basis of pre-existing security arrangements. Actually, America and the United Kingdom had some sort of security treaty or defensive alliance since 1941. Then, in the aftermath of the war, the United Kingdom and France signed on a treaty against Germany, against future possible aggression with Germany, and then other countries joined, and in 1949, the structure of the NATO evolved under American leadership. To understand the logic of that, we need to refer to something that political philosophers and historians of diplomacy call the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is the philosophical foundation behind the strategic development called the NATO. And that philosophy was simply a resistance of America to anything understood as the threat of Soviet influence or expansion of the Soviet influence. Communist influence or socialist influence, the attempts of the Soviet Union at the time to dominate certain countries, to reshape their economies, to land their mode of development, their philosophy, their ideology. America at the time declared itself as a guardian of free world and market economy. That much is clear. The Truman Doctrine, in a way, understanding what Truman Doctrine is quite fundamental even to understanding American policy today. I would say that, of course, this world is that world that effectively created, to which Truman Doctrine reacted, is now over. But if you think about American foreign policy today in these terms, you perhaps will not be very wrong. The real corrective to that policy came with President Trump, really, where the most perceptible modification to it is you could say that Trump created its own commercial version of Truman Doctrine. The question that American policymakers now are asking is not necessarily whether or not America needs to interfere in every single case where political freedom is threatened, but what would America gain as a result of that? In other words, Trump's doctrine is a Truman's doctrine in a way with an accountancy book open. Will America gain from that? Will it lose from that? If it looks like it's going, the costs outweigh with benefits, is the interference actually sensible? I'm now going to draw a line under that. I think that much is clear. I will only say that West Germany, interestingly, and at the time we're talking about West Germany, not United Germany, of course, was quite a late arrival to the NATO. For that to happen, Germany first had to be forgiven. Between 49 and 55, Germany underwent a process, and further into the second half of the 20th century, West Germany underwent a process of denazification, a tremendous reshuffling of popular culture and society. And it is that, Germany joining the NATO, that in a way triggered the Soviet Union to create its own defensive alliance. So NATO was a defensive alliance of pro-American forces. The Warsaw Pact that came into existence in 1955 became the defensive alliance sponsored by the Soviet Union. And so the history of Europe between 49 and, till now, really, is defined by this relationship of the still existing NATO and now defunct, the Warsaw Pact. What happened in 1991, in that fateful December, is that the Soviet Union collapsed and the world woke up without an enemy. The Warsaw Pact, that defensive alliance of the Soviet Union and its satellites, collapsed even earlier. It collapsed in the summer of 1991. Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union are buried in the same grave. The question becomes then, what happens to the NATO? What is the purpose of its existence in a world, theoretically, without an enemy? In the next few minutes, I'm going to look into that. What happened in the course of the 90s, and let's just say, and into the 21st century, can be described, and I'm paraphrasing Vladimir Lenin slightly, by three words: expansion, expansion, and expansion of the NATO. And if I have to describe the Russian position on that, then the three words are opposition, opposition, and opposition. The first expansion of NATO that swallowed three countries previously belonging to the Warsaw Pact happened in 1999, and then Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary entered the NATO. And then there was a major wave of expansion in 2004, and that brought into the NATO pretty much the entire world that previously existed under the Warsaw Pact. And very importantly, three republics, or three countries that were former republics of the Soviet Union, so they were not satellites. The Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, were actually members of the Soviet Union. That enlargement happened. Then, and that is already in the wake of the war in Ukraine, also Sweden and Finland joined, but that is outside of the scope of my interest for now. 2004 is really the watershed year in the sense that almost the entire Warsaw Pact became now part of the NATO, and two countries remained as countries that could be characterized as countries with an aspiration to join it, judging by effectively examining the diplomacy of that time. These two countries are Ukraine and Georgia. How did Russia respond to that? Militarily, it didn't. How did it respond diplomatically? It's very, very difficult to characterize something like that without reference to another well understood event, and I will do so now. About a year ago, a little longer maybe, Israel and Iran entered an era of military hostilities, and then also United States of America entered the picture. At that time, journalists, diplomats questioned President Trump's commitment to that war. They questioned his intentions. They tried to understand what actually led to that, to what extent they can expect, let's say, for how long they can expect this to continue, the hidden agenda, etc. In response to all of these queries, the White House very quickly produced a document that included, I think, something like 40 public statements by President Trump going way back in the past, where he very consistently expressed his opposition to Iran having nuclear weapons. You can argue with the very position, of course, that depends on your political opinion. You can argue with the pragmatism of that. You can argue with all sorts of things. But what you cannot argue with is consistency of that position. That is the reference against which I want to examine the Russian position in relation to the NATO enlargement. And I could say only one thing, that in the course of the years between 1991 and now, effectively, that position of Russian leadership, Vladimir Putin, but not just him, the diplomatic corps, the previous president, Boris Yeltsin, the Russian position was very consistently vocalized. The Russian opposition to the expansion of NATO was made very clear on multiple occasions. In various videos and articles that you will find on this topic, certain events are treated as watershed events. For example, Putin's speech at Munich conference in 2007, where he expressed very clear opposition to the NATO. In historical literature, you will find, for example, references to diplomatic exchanges. American diplomats stationed in Moscow wrote to their superiors in Washington, saying that according to the best of the intelligence they could collect, the opposition to the expansion of NATO is present in all political circles in Russia, irrespective of their specific, peculiar political positions, their relationship with Vladimir Putin, etc. In particular, the sore point, particular sore point, and that was the expansion of NATO interests towards Ukraine and Georgia. So, just like positions of President Trump with relation to Iran was consistent and consistently vocalized, the position of the Russian leadership in relation to the enlargement of NATO, their categorical opposition, their categorical lack of acceptance, was very consistently and very vocally exposed. In the olden days, when the trees were tall and things were simple, people who trained in social sciences and humanities were asked to write literature reviews. These were, of course, long-term reflections on the state of research before a particular junior researcher entered the field. And writing it constituted a proof that you master all the existing opinions in the field. What we were never told then, and we should have been, is that all these scholar reviews have two parents, not just one. One parent is the intellect. That is something that we knew. The other is emotion, positionality, sensitivities, sensibilities, vulnerabilities, etc. We didn't know that, and we should have accounted for that. The biographical component that people study with respect to great works of literature, for example, it's intuitively understood that Leo Tolstoy must have written what he wrote because he was influenced by particular events and his family drama, for example. That is not the way we treat academic literature, and if we start doing it, we will understand better the nature of the views. The views and opinions that I would like to talk about are views that exist with respect to the Russia-Ukraine war, or, as Emmanuel Todd would rather have it, American war with Russia, and why not? When I was preparing this video, I conducted what amounts to literature reviews on two issues, two questions really, which I thought I ought to clarify to myself and to anyone who would listen to me. The first question I asked myself is the question of the impact of the NATO expansion on the war. To what extent it was actually influential in influencing the Russian leadership. NATO expanded. I illustrated that. How did the Russian leadership relate to it? That actually, as controversial as it sounds, is a simple one, because there's a clear, identifiable spectrum of opinion on this particular issue. The spectrum includes on the one pole, John Mearsheimer, for whom, of course, there isn't a question, for whom the expansion of the NATO is what caused the war. It was flying in the face of Russian concerns and wishes, repeated many times, and so the Russians launched the war as a preemptive measure. On the other side, on the other pole of the spectrum, are people like Sergei Radchenko and Timothy Snyder, historians of Russia or Russian-American relations, for whom the expansion of NATO doesn't have any significance really. What they really highlight is the scenario that I would call as the mummy returns scenario, meaning that they perceive Russia as an old imperial expansionist power. Domination, expansion into areas, into sort of in the neighborly areas, is the Russian nature. That's approximately the gist of the argument. The fact that Russia hasn't done it in the past decade or so, 15 years, is simply because Russia was weak. It was weakened by the reforms, by economic, radical political transformation, collapse of the Soviet Union. The Russian army was weak, we know that. And so that lull in hostilities between Russia and everyone else was exactly that, a lull. At one point, when Russia feels strong, it will return to its imperial expansionist behavior, and the war is an expression of that. Now we are ready to approach a second question, and that is a really mysterious question that I ask, and I simply do not have the full answer, but I have a crop of significant observations in the psychology of dealing with a difficult topic in social sciences. The question that I asked myself was, okay, the positions regarding the impact of the expansion of NATO on Russian leadership are contested, at least they're clear. What I want to understand is why the expansion of NATO in the first place. And it's not a trivial question, simply because when a military or defensive alliance exists, expands, operates, it ought to have some sort of a picture and a name with respect to who the enemy is. That determines who is in, who is out, of course, but it also depends military program, spending, type of armaments, many other issues. The very definition of the defensive alliance, if the words still have meaning, is that defensive alliance, and that invites a question of who it defends against whom, who is the enemy. I'm asking this question, and I'm not the only one, and not because Vladimir Putin asks this question all the time, or asked it in the past and didn't have an answer, but because a great number of scholars and diplomats ask the same question exactly. If the words have the meaning, have the previous meaning, then who is the enemy? If you really are interested in this subject and the psychology of dealing with difficult topics, do yourself a favor. Proceed from here to the YouTube channel of Kennan Institute in Washington. The institute is dedicated to the study of Eastern Europe and Russia. It's headed by Michael Kimmage, who is a very interesting scholar and a very good interviewer. Him and the institute produced the whole series of interviews, 20 or 25 in number, on the topic of the origins of the war in Ukraine. They can be found on the channel under the playlist. And some of them I saw more than once with a pen and paper. And when I was watching them in a very single-minded way. I was trying to find an answer to the question, why the NATO expanded? Who is the enemy? The interesting thing is that picking up the signal from those series was extremely difficult. And that's not for the lack of eloquence of Michael Kimmage or his interviewees. I noticed something very interesting happening when he presented this question to the interviewees, and he didn't do it much. In actual fact, he only presented it several times, and typically when he did, it was a question presented to those interviewees who were not very anti-Russian. When he did, however, I observed something incredible, really. Imagine, to understand the full meaning of that, is imagine yourself in a situation where you watch an interview with someone for 40 and 50 minutes, and by that time you understand the person's personality, style, and vocabulary quite well. It comes through very well. What I noticed is that when he presented this question to his interviewees, something changed in the pattern in which they spoke. Some of them were very articulate before. They became less articulate from that point onwards. Some of them were visibly embarrassed, cringed a little bit. Others, the more assertive types, became a lot more assertive. There was a degree of unease in dealing with that question. They gave some sort of answers, but the unease was visible. I identified this unease in many people with different opinions happening at the same point in time when presented with the question of the reasons behind the expansion of the NATO. If I have to summarize in very simple form the more informative answers that were given by Kimmage's interviewees, they fall in two categories. The first category is the category of the mummy returns. The mummy returns category basically says, and this was said under the breath by an American diplomat, that perception of Russia as an imperial power, as a candidate as an imperial power that one day will show its full colors, that will return, that is treated as an eternal adversary, if not an enemy, is something that is deep in the hearts of the American diplomats. They never abandoned that idea. It was always present. And if that is true, it is very easy to understand the expansion of the NATO. NATO is the alliance sponsored by America. And so, irrespective of what happened to the Cold War, if the perception of Russia as that adversary, eternal adversary, persists in some circles, then the expansion of NATO is the logical step. The Warsaw Pact or ideological struggle doesn't need to exist for that. Russia is Russia. It remains where it remains on the map. It is an imperial power, and so expansion of NATO is simply a preemptive measure to the perceived aggression on the side of Russia. The amount of words I spent on this topic is already much more than I heard, because I'm interpreting and trying to elaborate and present this argument in greater depth. But really, those who expressed this view were not as expansive or eloquent. They said less. than I have said before, and part of it with visible embarrassment. The second view, actually very much an underappreciated reflection that was offered by some of the diplomats, American diplomats, was that the role of the NATO is wider than it is popularly seen. And that is actually something that takes us to the very early days of the NATO. NATO has always been sort of an alliance that was developed by them as an American foreign policy instrument for managing the misbehaving Europe, no less. It is well understood and agreed by everyone really who pays attention to the geopolitics and European history. You don't need American diplomats for that. That Europe is a continent that erupts from time to time in a bloody war. In the course of the 20th century, Europe erupted twice, and it generated 2 world wars. It is full of geopolitical entities, most of them are small, that are permanently at cross purposes with each other. They fight. They have conflicts of interests. Think about France and Germany. Think about Greece and Turkey. These are historical rivalries. And so that splittedness and the existence of rivalries is a risk in Europe. How to take care of that, how to ensure the European peace, is to appoint a guardian that will create some sort of framework where all of these countries that don't normally collaborate with each other and sometimes fight each other will exist in peace under that hegemon, under that high power, within some sort of defense alliance. So that is the role of the NATO, bridging the unbridgeables and ensuring European peace. America is a guardian of the European peace, if you wish. That's a second explanation that I identified. Now, both explanations are interesting with respect to Russian claims. The first explanation that perceives Russia as an eternal adversary, all one can say is, if that is true, and it's not entirely clear to me to what extent that is prevalent in American diplomatic circles, but if it is true and it is felt by the Russians, then Russians, all I can say is that Russians understand Americans' intentions and the NATO intentions very clearly. If they are identified as an adversary, they behave as that adversary in response. Their diagnosis, if that is true, is not wrong. If the second explanation applies, so America is a guardian of the European peace and the necessity of that framework to extinguish and soften somehow the existing conflicts, then the question that presents itself under that scenario is really, well, if that is the case, then why not to expand the NATO in the direction of Russia? If Russia is that suspected candidate for expansion, then one way to extinguish that conflict is to apply the whole framework of the NATO onto Russia as well, and to create the mother of all peaces then. It is not entirely clear how the American diplomacy or Western diplomacy engages with that issue. One thing that needs to be said, and this video will not be complete without this information, it's very important. American diplomats communicate repeatedly that, and that is not wrong, that is actually correct, that in actual fact, there were 2 work packages to the American foreign policy in Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The expansion of NATO was just one. The other was actually collaboration with Russia. And having looked into the topic, I can say that significant progress was made on that front, and that is incredibly interesting. The collaboration with Russia, between Russia and the NATO, dates to the early 90s, and it was a significant and meaningful one. In the beginning of the 90s, Russia, Ukraine, and Georgia, in actual fact, entered an arrangement with the NATO called the Partnership for Peace, and subsequently no less than 3 councils were established for coordination between the NATO and Russia. In 1997, still under Boris Yeltsin, Russia and the NATO signed a declaration, joint declaration, that said that they do not perceive each other as enemies. In actual fact, collaboration with Russia lasted until 2014, so until Russian invasion into Crimea and the subsequent annexation. That is also very interesting. With the arrival of Putin, with the election of Putin to presidency in the beginning, on the very beginning of the 21st century, collaboration between the two actually expanded significantly, because at that time it was informed, it was done basically as a framework of the American new war against terror at the time, where Russia collaborated significantly. Russia and the United States and the NATO had significant differences of opinion about how, for example, the war in Yugoslavia should be handled, but that didn't prevent cooperation there either. In fact, Russian forces were stationed in Yugoslavia and in Bosnia, and the framework was found for them to cooperate with NATO without being under NATO. When we move into the new century, and I'm giving a very telegraphic account here, Russian cooperation extended into the American intervention in Afghanistan. Russians facilitated access to Afghanistan for the NATO. That is not something that is known at all, and I would like anyone who is interested in this topic to take that into account. These two tracks of the NATO policy. It is the right time now in this narrative to ask, well, what happened to it? If that existed, did it not offset the expansion? How does it actually sit with the expansion? What happened to it? How could the war of that nature erupt despite that collaboration? And my answer to you is that is not something that I could milk out of any literature or any interviews at all. It's a real door without a key within this topic. And my impression, gathered from the fact, from just observing the interviews, and it's very difficult to, for people who are being interviewed for a long period of time, it's very difficult to hide something. It's very difficult to hide an emotion. My impression was that simply something got botched in that process. It is not entirely clear by whom. It is not entirely clear whose responsibility it is. We may know, because these things become much clearer at a distance, something in the 25 and 50 years where certain documents became declassified and known, we may be able to construct the entire puzzle. But something happened there that now, or something was botched there, something didn't work where it should have worked, and now, it is my impression, those who know what happened are embarrassed to talk about that. Now, I'm now going to a different topic. I'm now going to a different topic, which I think if I don't cover, I will really be shortchanging you. A lot of people will ask me, having looked at this, having watched this video, what about the Ukrainian politics? You told us all sorts of different things about the NATO. You haven't told us anything about Ukraine. We know, because that's what the Western press cares to communicate, that Ukraine developed as a pro-Western society. It doesn't look for inspiration, political or cultural, in the direction of Russia. It wants to be Western. Is that not so? How does that thing, that characterization that the Western press creates, feeds into the equation? I will tell you how, and I will tell you something that you will not hear in the Western press, and if you're exposed to Western media, or indeed Russian media. For that, you need to come here. If we want to characterize the mood and the intellectual and cultural tendencies of the Ukrainians, what we need to do, or at least what we can do with great benefit, is to look at how they vote. Ukraine had very rich political life since the independence in the 21st century. All of that is very well documented. And what we see there, if we pay attention, is that Ukraine became almost a textbook example of a European country where foreign policy issue became defining for internal politics. It didn't happen immediately. The foreign policy issue is the political and economic military orientation towards the West versus Russia. That issue was never an issue of concern for Ukraine in the beginning of its independence. Other issues were more important. Economic recovery, for example. Learning how to be an independent country. That issue of which way to look West or Russia developed gradually, and it came to maturity in the beginning of the 21st century. Now, when I talk about the West versus Russia, EU versus Russia, NATO versus Russia, I'm fully aware that NATO doesn't equal European Union. These are different terms, of course. There are different meanings to them. There are different types of membership. Different things are meant by them. The question is here not what was meant originally, but how people perceive those membership at the level of Ukrainian population. From the point of view of Ukrainian population and any other Eastern European population, fine differences, fine distinctions are not made between different types of memberships. For most people, they don't know exactly what the NATO is. They can tell you something like NATO. I guess that's important. It's Western. And so for many people who are orientated towards the West, the membership of organizations like the NATO or the European Union is simply a membership in a prestigious club with high reputation of Western countries, prosperous countries, which they desire for their own society. Now, if we go to the Ukrainian elections from the beginning of Ukrainian independence until now, and we simply put the Ukrainian political parties on a pro-Western, pro-Russian spectrum, and we look at the degree of support which each of these parties got in the elections, the inevitable conclusion that we arrive at is that the Ukrainian population, Ukraine, is a split country. It's a country with two souls that compete for expression in Ukrainian politics and society. One is pro-Western and the other is pro-Russian, and they're almost equal in strength. For most of the Ukrainian history, from the time that this question was asked, which way to go, whether you look towards Moscow or towards Berlin, the answer that was given, 50% of the population sided with pro-Russian orientation and 50% with pro-Western, very consistently. That explains Ukrainian situation and Ukrainian tragedy, because we're dealing with genuinely split population. Life would have been easier if the division was 80 and 20, but it isn't, because it's exactly 50 and 50 with a regional dimension. Eastern and southern regions, those that now are under Russian control, those are regions actually that had a strong pro-Russian sentiment. The West had strong pro-Western sentiment. Countries in this situation need to learn how to live in simple terms. It is very difficult for them to exist. That explains a lot. That explains a lot of zigzagging in Ukrainian politics, zigzagging of different political parties. They sometimes change emphasis. That explains zigzagging of Ukrainian presidents. Sometimes they start with a certain platform, political platform, and they change it simply because the country, the presidents, the parties are torn by those different orientations in almost equal measure. If we abandon the simplistic view of Ukrainian politics as binary, pro or against Russia, or pro against the West, or the NATO and the EU, and create a more balanced view and say, okay, let's identify a group of parties, political parties that have that favor the balancing act between the two, that want to avoid polarization, if you wish. And such parties exist, by the way. If we want to perform that exercise along the lines that I described, our conclusion is not going to change. In that case, if you go that far, then you will receive three souls to the Ukrainian electorate: the pro-Russian, the pro-Western, and sort of neutral, almost in equal measures. So no matter what framework you impose, you receive that. It almost doesn't matter at what time you look at it. You receive that. Now, to describe this drama to the Westerner, I must reflect on the Western politics and ask myself, is there something similar in Western politics, something similarly binary and similarly tragic? or controversial. And that is very easy to do in this day and age. If you think about American politics, it's an issue of Trump election in 2016 and 24. If you think about the British politics, it's the EU referendum in 2016. On both issues, the election of Trump twice in a row and the Brexit referendum, the electorate was genuinely split in almost equal shares. The political outcome for United States and Britain was binary. In the end, the political decision was made by simple majority, and if 51% expressed the desire to leave the European Union, that's what happened. And it was implemented by now. But really, the almost equal proportion of population did not side with that outcome. When the political decision was made, that side, that segment of population did not disappear. It continues to exist. It continues to contest the outcome. It continues to contribute to the political conversation. The country, Britain in this particular case, with respect to this issue, still has two souls. It is unadvisable to emphasize one of them at the expense of the other just because the political outcome was binary ultimately. The country remains split on that issue. Nate Silver, who is a data scientist with a dedicated significant part of his attention to the American election, pointed out with respect to Trump that American journalists and commentators of all shades and colors like to emphasize the fact in their commentary, whether they're pro or against Trump, doesn't matter in this case. They try to interpret the part of the reality where Trump won. They dedicate their analysis to the question why, how Trump won, what it testifies, what kind of testimony it is to the state of America, American population. In a situation, and that's not Nate Silver's contribution, in a situation where the country is split almost in two halves, there's the same degree with the same degree of justice or enthusiasm, you can analyze a question of why or how Trump lost, because it could have easily happened. In the United Kingdom, the same is true with respect to the referendum. That's because the country still remains split. And so to summarize this part, I can say that the question of Russia versus West orientation for Ukraine is what Brexit is for Britain and Trump is for America. I will finish where I began. According to Emmanuel Todd, the war that is now raging in the heart of Europe is not Russia-Ukraine war. It's actually US-Russia war. Is it then an American war? And the analysis that I conducted of the evolution of the NATO and the relationship between US and Russia after the fall of communism was deliberately designed to lead you to some sort of answer. It's easy to agree. Now it is easy to agree because that analysis revealed something more fundamental. What it suggests to us that not only this war that we observe now is actually US-Russia war, but the peace that preceded it was the US peace. The entire history of NATO suggests one thing only, and I don't think I'm going to say something revolutionary here, but really it needs to be said from time to time. American relationship with Europe, West and East subsequently, is essentially a vassalic relationship. So in analysis of medieval societies, for example, in Britain, they show you the particular structure of the social elite, typically with a king at the top, and then at the bottom there are several quite important and rich barons. They supply services to the king, they supply the army, and they're given land and assets as a payment to their services. Under those, the next layer, smaller barons, they supply services to the bigger barons. So, and then etc. etc. There are smaller and smaller barons, and that forms a vassalic system. I think we have no choice, really. That is how Europe and United States look, and the embodiment, the official embodiment of that, is the structure of the NATO. The United States was a guardian of European peace, acted as such since the beginning, since the end of the Second World War, and for a good reason, for a very good reason. Europe erupted into two world wars in a period that preceded it. It is an extremely split continent. Those who look at Europe today really need to relate to travel back in time about 100 years or so and ask themselves a very simple question. That physical, geographical region, that territory that is now somewhere between Russia and the Atlantic Ocean, how many states were there, for example, in the beginning of the 20th century? The answer is about 20. That tremendous piece of land was effectively managed by the Russian Empire, Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and there were many others, about 20 in number. If you look at that very territory today, you will see 40 or 45, depends on how you count, independent states there. So that was the history of the 20th and the 21st century. The last accord in that was, of course, the decomposition of Yugoslavia. The countries, the components became smaller and smaller. They split, not necessarily neatly along the ethnic lines or national lines, but something like that. So diversity, that diversity, regional diversity, has never been European strength, and it isn't. It was a weakness that lent itself to repeated wars. The idea that that European system will be somehow under the guardianship of a higher power is not such an absurd idea, ultimately. Interestingly, the perception of the United States of America in relation to Russia has undergone some change today. And I think that may affect the vassalic relationship as well, and the way Europe starts thinking about Russia. This is for the simple reason. In vassalic relationships, the smaller vassals cannot have independent opinions. They cannot afford them. They're in a position of a structural weakness. And that goes towards an idea where I tend to disagree with Todd. I tend to disagree with him when he says that European behavior he sees it as a behavior that is basically in opposition or goes against the independent interests of European countries. I think many European countries today, those that exist within the framework of NATO, actually their primary interest they see as being aligned with hegemon at the top, because of their weakness, because of their size, because of the internal turmoil, internal contradictions that exist among them, because they're in some sort of self-preservation mode. And that served them well, relatively well, because it was American peace before it became the American war. So by saying that they operate against their own interests and bringing their decision to detach themselves from Russian markets, from Russian resources, natural gas, for example, what Todd is saying that material interests ultimately are superior to those considerations of security or some sort of spiritual interests, etc., etc. That may not be so, not on the bread alone. And if material interests were the beginning and the end of everything, then Soviet Union wouldn't have existed. This was in terms of material prosperity, it was forever inferior to the West. Yet it survived in the name of a certain idea, with full acknowledgement that these levels of development simply cannot be, the Western, the capitalist levels of development cannot be matched within the managed or command economies. So that is where I diverge. Yes, it is an American war, for the reasons that I explained. I don't think Western Europe in particular leaves with a sense of compromise or at least it's a manageable compromise, and they see there are their interests in that situation and in current order and their current behavior they see as promoting certain interests. They may not be economic interests, but there are other interests as well. With respect to Eastern Europe, the story is completely different. And I must say that the psychological and spiritual state of Eastern Europe is probably the blind spot of Todd's analysis, and that's understandable. Eastern Europe, with its identities, is just being born. It existed under the Soviet domination for a long time, and since that time, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, what happened there is that Eastern European elites formed, by and large, two blocks. One block, which is nowhere near as visible as it should be for proper understanding of these dynamics, is the sentimental block. These are people who are approximately 45, 50 years old and over. And some of their lives, their childhood for sure, but sometimes teenage years, was spent under the Soviet system, under the Soviet domination. These people reflect, or many of them at the very least, many of them would reflect on that time of Soviet domination as time where things were very stable. Social security was quite high. The sense of identity was really admirably strong. People knew everyone had their place. The right and wrong were completely clearly delineated. So both the sense of identity, the spiritual component, and to some extent, if you don't go too deep into comparison with the Western world, also the material component were in a safe place. There is a saying, and I think it's right somewhere, that people don't really have a motherland apart from their childhood. So for many of these people, and these are now members of Eastern European elites, that is also their childhood, and hence the sentimental component. They also understand, because they lived mentally, educationally, under the Soviet system, they understand what can be called the Russian soul. And don't forget, by the way, a very important identity component, which is a very strong anti-Nazi component to the post-war Russian identity. Russia, or Soviet Union at the time, presented itself, and there is truth in it, as a liberator of Eastern Europe. And so that identity and the joint struggle against Nazism across Poland, across Hungary, across Czechoslovakia at the time, was something that was paraded and perpetuated. So it's a tremendous sense of security, and I would say moral security in these societies that still lasts in some circles. Alongside those people, of course, there are pro-Western elements. Typically, they're younger and they're very, very eminent in politics. I think they're the best known to the Western observer. Those people, if the challenge of the pro-Russian crowd is to somehow engage productively with their own sentimentality, the challenge of the pro-Western circles is to deal with resentment or embitterment, which they feel. And that also has a degree of truth in it, that their societies and themselves were simply shortchanged by fate. They fell under the Soviet domination, and Soviet domination resulted, and it's well known, in inferior levels of economic prosperity in Eastern Europe compared to Western Europe. These societies led frugal existence compared to any country in the West. That is well known, and so today they are in a state that still that can be characterized as some sort of delayed development. And from the point of view of westernized elites, that in itself is very regrettable, perhaps unforgivable. There is another part to Western European magic, to Western way of life, that really has a strong influence on Eastern European elites, and that magic is political freedom. and the culture of tolerance, what's called liberalism today. They really are enchanted by that, and what they don't necessarily understand very well, because they haven't traveled with the West for such a long period of time, that thing is as a result of a very peculiar historical path of individualism that the Western Europe had gone through. It is rooted in family patterns of the past. It is rooted in particular political and the religious developments of the past. There's a great question, it's a real question whether or not those patterns can be simply lifted and replicated with success somewhere else, be it Eastern Europe or the Middle East, whether that thing is the reasonable goal for others to aspire to and see full implementation of that in their context, because they themselves also have peculiar paths of development that may stand in the way. So because I think Westernizers somewhat confuse the two or think that they're somehow related or causally related, let's say liberalism causes prosperity, that may be the explanation behind the enthusiasm, let's say. They cannot separate the two. These forces fight, compete for expression in Eastern European elites and Eastern European populations. These are not fully formed, if you wish, societies in the final stage of development. And of course, they occupy the lowest position in the vassalic system headed by the United States. Especially when we talk about pro-Western elites in Eastern European countries, they are very eager to simply repeat what they're being told by their vassals and by the top vassal as well. Now let us ask ourselves, are they missing on something? Do not they see their interests correctly there? That is an impossible thing to say. They see their interests, well, in the way they see them. Russian gas or Russian favors of other kinds may not interest them at this point in their development. Something else is more tempting. I would also say that there is a great deal of optimism in my heart for a simple reason. If the system is inherently vassalic, and we need to relate to that statement very seriously, you see, when there is any discussion being held about the ancient world, we understand almost on an instinct that in that world, a particular period in time, Roman Empire was the world hegemon. It was the hegemon of the known Mediterranean world, and everyone around it was dominated by that, militarily, but it was not all about coercion. When you have an empire like that, that is so big, so powerful, unambiguously superior, unambiguously hegemon, then that situation creates its own dynamic. Its fashions, intellectual fashions, for example, its ways of thinking become fashionable effortlessly. They're being emulated. They're the source of respect, of honor. It's something reputable. It's a reputable thing to do. And so social change may happen when something happens within that hegemon, when one of the fashions which are present and allowed, authorized by the hegemon, then percolates down the vassalic system. The moment hegemon loses interest in certain adventures, for example, in this oppositional relationship with Russia, that sooner or later will percolate to the next level and then to the next level. And that gives me a reason to be reasonably optimistic. I think the Trump doctrine, which is a sort of a correction of Truman's doctrine, is very different. Something changed at the very top, and it will percolate sooner or later. The Trump administration so far has proven itself as an administration that is interested in other things. Perhaps, and I'm speculating here, but it's not unreasonable, it asks itself the very question I asked in the beginning. If this Soviet-sponsored system collapsed, and there isn't an ideological opposition, the struggle of two ideologies, two ways of life which present themselves as absolute alternatives, mutually exclusive, if there isn't that, What's left out of that, let's say, oppositionality with Russia? Maybe there isn't much. Maybe there are other things that are important. China being one of them, the Middle East being another, something that will benefit that hegemon, United States, in a more tangible manner. So the moment change happens there, it will percolate. Let's see what happens. Watch that space, I should say. The last thing I'm going to say is this. In the first video I recorded on this topic, I said that at this time, Emmanuel Todd's book, The Defeat of the West, remains untranslated into English. I familiarized myself with this in Russian, and I know that translations exist into German, Spanish, and Italian. Somebody in the comments to the first video corrected me, saying that there is a translation into English that is being now prepared, and it will be available at some point in February 2027. I'll believe it when I see it. But the mystery is still there, right? Don't relax. If you ask yourself, okay, so who is the publisher ultimately of that English translation? You wouldn't believe it. It is Verso. Verso, for anyone who pays attention to these matters, is a radical publisher in Europe. They publish books in left-wing thought, in history of communism, radical left, etc., etc. Go to their website and familiarize yourself and see for yourself. So, Emmanuel Todd's book, The Defeat of the West, is destined to end up on the same shelf as Lenin's. And I'm told there is absolutely nothing to worry about.